Hey church, and welcome to this week's small group. Today I want us to deal with discouragement, especially when it comes to being on mission for Jesus. I mean, how many times do we do something for Jesus and it doesn't work out and we get discouraged and we're like, you know what, I'm never going to do that again. I mean, all of the small group leaders, you can explain to your group what it does to you when you invite everybody to come to a small group and then nobody shows up. Or perhaps some of you have tried to invite people to church and you invite a bunch of people and not one of them comes. And it's like, oh man. Or perhaps you take the leap of faith of sharing Jesus with somebody and then they're rude to you. What discourages you more from fulfilling Jesus' mission in your life? Your feeling of unworthiness or the cost of following Jesus? Why? You know, I think I deal with discouragement these days more than anything else. Now, even though Jesus had resurrected, Peter was discouraged. Why was he discouraged? Because he had denied Jesus. He had always thought that he was the strongest disciple, but come to find out, in the moment of weakness, he was the weakest disciple. So start out today's small group by reading John chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. Have you ever experienced a season when you felt like returning to fishing instead of trusting in God and returning to Jesus' mission? And how did your faith outlast the situation? You know what I find ironic is that so many people think that I'm a confident person. And I'm going to confess to you that there's been several times in my ministry where I felt like such a failure that I considered quitting ministry. I just felt like I had let Jesus and everyone else down. And I felt like anyone else can do a better job than I can do. So read John chapter 21, verses 4 through 8. What circumstances have you experienced in which you felt like all you could say is, "It is the Lord"? I will never forget the day that I preached the absolute worst sermon of my life. I remember I was a youth pastor, and when I was done, I just wanted to go hide because I was embarrassed about how bad the sermon was. You know, and I didn't even understand what I had preached. Like if you were to ask me, so what were you preaching? Like I didn't even get it. But that day, several students said yes to Jesus. You know, that was the day that all I could say was, man, it must be the Lord. It wasn't me at all, for sure. Read John chapter 21, verses 9 through 14. Imagine you were one of the disciples that day. What was Jesus communicating when he provided breakfast for the disciples? And what has Jesus done to remind you that he is with you and that he cares for your needs? So next I want you to reread John chapter 21, verses 9 through 11. Just reread those verses. And then read John chapter 18, verses 17 through 18 and verses 25 through 27. And then when you're done with that, read Luke chapter 5, verses 4 through 10 in a version other than the NIV. What do you notice about the details of the fire in John chapter 21, verse 9 and in John chapter 18, verse 18? And this is why it's important in a different translation from the NIV, because the NIV doesn't make that distinction. And what do you think was going on in Peter's mind as the smell of the fire brought him back to the night of his betrayal of Jesus? And by performing the same fishing miracle with Peter, what do you think Jesus was setting up Peter to do? In John chapter 21, verse 9, and also in John chapter 18, verse 18, we see the Greek word anthrakia, which is the Greek word for a charcoal fire. Here's what you need to know. Those are the only 2 times in the Bible that that word is used. You see, John, who is the author of the book of John, was showing that Jesus was intentionally making Peter remember the betrayal so that Jesus could deal with it. Jesus wanted Peter back on mission to become a fisher of men again. That's why he did the same miracle over again. Read John chapter 21, verses 15 through 19. And if there's anybody in the small group that can understand Spanish, I want you to read and explain from a Spanish Bible these verses if possible. Because we only have 1 word for love in English, but in Spanish there's 2 words for love. What exactly was Jesus communicating to Peter in these verses? Man, what a deep moment between Jesus and Peter. And there's layers of meaning to that passage. Sometimes we ask, why do I have to suffer when those people don't have to suffer? Why do they have more money than me? God seems so unfair. With that in mind, I want you to read John chapter 21, verses 20 through 23. Why do we find it so easy to question why God has different plans for different people? And according to these verses, what is Jesus' response to us when we question those plans? And make the response in your own words. So we started out our small group by talking about our feelings of unworthiness and also the fear of the cost of following Jesus. So let's close out with this question. How does Jesus deal with our feelings of unworthiness and our fear? And after you answer that question, I want you to close in prayer and ask Jesus to restore us when we feel defeated. Have a great rest of your small group. I'll be there on Sunday. Have a great rest of the week.